Okay, hello and welcome. My name is Faisal Khwele, and I'm a master's student at the European New School of Digital Studies, doing the Masters of Digital Entrepreneurship. And I am here joined today by one of the most esteemed academics in AI legislation, one of my professors as well. And maybe not just in Germany, but arguably worldwide. A Yale graduate, and when he's not so busy counseling at the Bundestag or attending international conferences or even organizing his own, he may not have records in the numerous marathons he runs, but that's a very well possibility that he has records in the numbers of papers he publishes. I am joined today by Professor Philip Hacker.
Thanks for having me, Faisal. It's really great to be on this first podcast episode.
Hopefully one of many. And so welcome to today. And so to get started, I would like to ask you about just the general nature of the philosophy behind AI legislation. So there's a particular philosophy behind legislating anything, from fridges to penal codes. So what do you think is the general driving philosophy behind AI legislation?
That's a really good and also a really tough question. How many hours do I have? So basically, in a nutshell, the idea is that we have, I'd say, two different types of regulation when it comes to AI. It's not the case that in the EU or the US, AI is totally unregulated. There are lots of laws, such as data protection law, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, GDPR, which some people might know, non-discrimination law, liability law, that apply irrespective of whether you're using AI or not. If I hurt somebody, whether I punch you in the face or I hurt you verbally, doesn't matter if I use AI to execute that or not. I will be, to a certain extent, responsible. So that's regulation, that's general regulation, technology neutral, and that applies to basically everything, and it regulates certain outcomes. So I cannot harm somebody without a reason. I cannot discriminate against somebody. I cannot process somebody's data without their consent or another good reason. And that applies to AI as well. So this is what I call outcome-based regulation. There are certain things you can't do. And then basically, the policymakers came together, and many academics as well, and I was a bit involved in this too, and we sat down and thought, well, maybe in AI, this is not enough, because AI is so complex, and it's oftentimes very opaque. It's difficult to know what's going on inside the AI, and it's also difficult to know who is responsible for it. And particularly people, when they are facing some kind of AI, and they're subject to its decisions, they often won't know if, for example, they're discriminated against, or if they're actually harmed because other people are being treated in a better way. And so that's why people started looking into this AI pipeline, as it's called, so the way in which AI is developed and deployed more concretely. And now the EU AI Act basically has this procedural focus, a procedural type of regulation. So it doesn't look at the outcome. It says, well, we also have to make sure that in the process, the risk of, for example, discriminating against somebody inadvertently by means of AI is mitigated. So to give you an example, you now have to, if you're an AI developer, you have to look at the data sets that you're using. And if you find out that the data sets that you're using are not nicely balanced because, for example, it contains mainly male, white, middle-aged individuals like myself, then you have to change that. And you have to bring in more diversity because we know that otherwise the AI will discriminate against people, people of color or other people. So that's one thing where the regulatory philosophy has really changed. And within the AI Act, and this is something really interesting, within the AI Act, we follow a risk-based approach. And I'm happy to talk more about this because there's this tension kind of between a risk-based approach that looks specifically at certain use case risks and the regulation of foundation models, such as ChatGPT or other general purpose technologies that can be used for many different purposes and thus have a very, very diverse risk profile.
Oh, I see. So there are like many different avenues in regards to the AI legislation, from protection to discrimination and bias. And it's kind of interesting to see that this is one of the first kinds of legislation that takes representation as a huge aspect of just building the legislation itself. Because, well, for a lack of representation, we will have bias and discrimination. But that has been also one of the biggest aspects or avenues of discussion, just generally with people, as well as especially with legislators. What do you think in certain like aspects, focusing on certain parts of the conversation, have maybe neglected others? What do you think is lost in the debates?
In the debates around the AI Act, you mean? I think one of the points that was a little bit underrepresented is the fact that, of course, when we are talking about AI and legislation, we necessarily talk about risks, because otherwise you don't have to regulate it. So if everything's going well, I don't need a regulation for it. And that's why lawyers and policymakers often focus on these risks, and sometimes also on extreme risks. That there is this debate about existential risk, about whether AI at the end might wipe out the whole of humanity. I don't think there is a really significant risk of this happening. But this was kind of a bit of a distraction, and it brought in a whole discourse about excessive risks in AI that made us neglect to a certain extent the fact that we really do need AI in a lot of settings to actually care for our future and to make our economy and our society future-proof. Give you an example. In medicine, for example, we have a real problem of recruiting in Germany, for example, enough doctors that serve in the countryside. We have way too few doctors in clinics. And my sister is actually a physicist in a pretty well-known big clinic in southern Germany. And she tells me every time that, everybody's working hardcore, but they're just absolutely at the limits of what they can do. And people are actually dying because there's just not enough doctors. Now, one important avenue for addressing this problem, obviously, is to give more money to the healthcare sector, and that's something we should absolutely work on. But another avenue, since money doesn't grow on trees, is to use more AI for certain kinds of diagnostics, for certain kinds of also administrative patterns that are taking a lot of time away from the doctors to actually use for patient care. So I think going forward, we will need much more AI in these and other fields to actually bring value to the people, to cure people, or to work in the economy, but only, of course, if that AI system is done well in a responsible manner and in a sustainable manner. So that's one conversation that I think was missing a little bit, the opportunities. And we need to have in the AI Act ways to make sure that these opportunities can be reaped. And that's something I try to push into the AI Act, and there are certain now rules that allow, for example, developers and deployers, if they have some ideas about how their specific products should be regulated, they can write this up, submit this to an authority, and the authority can look at it, the European Commission, for example, and say, hey, this is a good idea, and put a stamp on it, and then they can go ahead with this and basically have a safe harbor. And this is one of the proposals that I brought in, and I think is really important because this gives some legal certainty. And a second aspect that is super important, I think that is in the end totally neglected in the AI Act, is the question of sustainability. So the question of how does AI interact with climate change? I'm happy to talk more about this, but that's also one aspect where, in the end, in the political compromise, many of the rules that would have provided for AI to focus more on not using so much water, not using so much energy. Many of those rules were kicked out. You might know that a longer conversation with ChatGPT, depending on the exact context, but will often consume as much as half a liter of water. And with 100 million and more users, of course, that's a whole lot. And if you just generate one image with a really big and good image generator, that consumes as much energy as fully charging your smartphone. And again, people are doing this for fun and all the time. And this is a massive problem. AI can do a lot to help our climate because you can optimize the electric grid. You can find new ways of cooling data centers, but it also consumes a heck of a lot of electricity and water, and that's a big unaddressed problem. And that's actually one of the things that I'm going to be dealing with in my research going forward.
Especially recently with OpenAI's new video creation features. So I'm just trying to imagine the level of impact that would have. Like, we are not even still out of the crypto bubble, more or less, and just the environmental impact that has had with mining and how much energy it just uses. And based on some research, especially Kate Crawford's research in regards to AI as well as machine learning being the new extractive industry of the future, meaning that in the past we've had different extractive industries, whether that was metal or coal or maybe oil. So in the new and forthcoming future, it's imagined that AI and machine learning is going to be that industry. So do you suppose that that should be one of the primary aspects of future legislation in regards to AI?
Yes, I definitely think so. First, what we need is transparency. And this is something that the AI Act, to a certain extent, puts into motion. So if you're a foundation model developer, so basically you're developing these large models like ChatGPT or Sora, the new video model that OpenAI released, then you have to tell your audience, basically you have to tell the world in your disclosures how much energy approximately, to the best extent you can calculate this, the model consumes during development and deployment. But that's not enough, because we all know that we have had transparency in so many fields, in financial regulation, and people mostly just don't read it. They just ignore it. It's good for some, for some hacks, for some, some people, for some nerds like myself, or who could, look at that, or other researchers, Sasha Lucioni, for example. She's very active in this field. She's a researcher at Hugging Face, and watchdogs, NGOs. They can look at this. That's often not enough. So we need more concrete rules that make sure that that AI actually is not going to become the next big extractive industry. It's always going to consume water and electricity. That's the way with many of our civilizatory techniques and technologies. But we should make sure that this is done for a purpose, for a good purpose, and not because some people want to play around with video generation and consume tons and tons of electricity just for fun, basically. And I think we have to clamp down on this a little bit in terms of entertainment. And for example, we could think about integrating AI development and deployment into an emissions trading system, which is a well-known system for heavily extractive or consumptive industries, to make sure that they don't consume more energy than the total that is allotted to them, and that in the end, this energy is then consumed by those who can make best use of it. There are many problems with this approach, of course, but over the years, I think it has become one of the most politically successful maneuvers. We can also think about a CO2 tax, a carbon tax, which I think would be great, but unfortunately, politically speaking, it's very unlikely that this is going to happen either in the EU or in the US. So I think our best bet really is to use the existing structures of emissions trading and say, hey, if you want to consume a lot of energy for training your AI systems or for deploying it for whatever, you need to pay for it. And if you want to consume really a lot, then you have to pay more for it. And then you're going to think twice about whether you really need that energy or not.
That sounds a very plausible approach to the sustainability aspect, especially the environmental sustainability. However, there are also other aspects that are often talked about, especially like with just the general public, but you may feel are underrepresented, especially when it comes to legislation, so-called windfall taxes, one of which being all of the people who have their livelihoods jeopardized, for example, with introduction of new and different AIs. And so there have been different approaches. Certain countries, governments have chose to ignore this altogether. Others have went ahead and banned applications like ChatGPT or other AI applications. So do you think there should be also an avenue where people's livelihoods, people's jobs are protected? And this is a general scenario that we feel that is often associated with new and nascent technologies. So it's a new technology. It's going to change the world. It's going to make the world a better place. But let's just ignore all these people who are actually negatively affected of it. And there's always associated with, well, the cat's out of the bag. We have AI now. We can't go back. So should these problems be associated, should they be addressed with any forthcoming AI legislation?
Yeah, I think that's a really urgent task, and it's good that you mention it because it's also one of the areas that was quite clearly neglected. Now, let me say that it's always easy to look at many different aspects now that were not in the AI Act. The AI Act was not meant to solve all these problems. It was meant to be an AI safety instrument. Let's say it comes from a product safety philosophy, looking at what are the key risks and how can we mitigate them in the process of making AI. And there's other risks. You could mention also copyright that wasn't really addressed. But copyright is perhaps a good one to, perhaps we can talk about this later a little bit, because it also endangers livelihoods quite clearly of illustrators, writers, and there have been, strike in Hollywood and all of those things where people suddenly woke up and thought, whoa, this might actually take away my job. The jury is still out on whether AI is actually augmenting tasks or substituting tasks or jobs, let's say. It's certainly taking away some subtasks. It's less clear whether it's actually taking away jobs in so many fields. It will take away some jobs, that's for sure. It's unclear whether that's going to be true across the board. And of course, it's difficult to guarantee to someone that, their type of work will remain the same over its entire lifetime. Otherwise we would still have people typing on writing on paper instead of on computer. So there is a certain need for people to adapt, but we have to help them with this. And here are two suggestions. So one is very concretely that we need to massively invest in upskilling initiatives, and not only for those who are the best and most nimble, but also for those precisely who are negatively infected and who might be in danger of losing their job, or who might be just seeing that their job profile change so much that they ultimately have to drop out of the job. So for those, we have to find solutions to actually invest massively in AI literacy. And by the way, also for school kids and for people of every age, but particularly also the young ones, to make sure that they know what's coming and that they know the dangers and they know how to critically deal with this. And the second proposal, besides this upskilling AI literacy, is that we have to think about all those click workers that are actually used in training the AI system. So you have probably heard about the story in Time magazine that OpenAI used a lot of Kenyan workers in Kenya, Africa, for training their systems, basically for ridding it of the worst of the worst, to make sure that it doesn't spew out all kinds of violence or hate speech and so on. And to do that, people have to sift through incredible amounts of insane violence, child abuse material, and all this stuff. Now, unfortunately, at the moment, there is not a good alternative to this. You might want to use more synthetic data, and I could imagine a rule whereby companies are required to at least use the state-of-the-art synthetic material that can be somehow controlled in order to free people from this toil. But there was a big outcry about this at the time, and rightly so. But that's not a problem that's limited to AI. All kinds of menial and difficult jobs are outsourced to somewhere on the planet. And I think what's really important is to have some kind of worker protection and to make sure that companies who are hiring people around the world adhere to good standards. This is one thing that, for example, in a different legislation, and the supply chain legislation, is being addressed at the EU level, and they want to make sure that companies can be held liable if somebody down the supply chain is abused, in terms of the workers are being abused. So that's a big, big problem in AI, but not only in AI. And that actually holds for so many aspects. As you said, basically it's a new technology. And we can also talk about quantum computing or about 6G networks or whatever. All this is going to, sooner or later, change the way we interact. And there's going to be ups and downs, and people have to adapt. But at the same time, we need to make sure that across the board, these different risks are properly addressed and that we don't leave people behind. There will be losers, but that at least we show them how they could potentially avoid that scenario.
It's very similar to already pre-existing problems that we had that we just seem to, in a sense, keep repeating. Like the aspect of possible AIs developed by, click workers all around the globe, like the one you mentioned, is very similar to, for example, fast fashion companies using labor from all over the world, oftentimes child labor or just highly exploited labor. And so it falls in the same, pitfall.
Yeah.
So do you think that there should be ramifications if companies continue to do these practices? Because correct me if I'm wrong, if a product like if a certain sweater from a fast fashion manufacturer was actually traced for, child labor or the sort, there would be ramifications.
Yeah, that's a tricky problem, but there might be under several legal acts, both in the US and in the EU, and I don't know much about other countries or jurisdictions. But that's precisely what's under discussion right now, and that's what clearly policymakers, at least many policymakers, want to do, to hold companies responsible for this so that they actually make sure that it's not just written in the contract that, the subcontractor needs to adhere to good practices and best standards and uphold human rights, blah, 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 but actually that there is a system in place, a monitoring and compliance system to make sure that this is really enacted. And if it's not, then you can sue them. And I think that's the right approach, because otherwise we're just not going to get rid of it. You need to have realistic expectations, of course. So you can't wish away the fact that some people are going to do dumb jobs, boring jobs, dangerous jobs. That's just the way it is. But we can make sure that at least some protections are in place. And I think the good thing about AI is that we can try at least to use different data techniques, curation techniques, automation techniques to reduce the amount of exposure of affected individuals to such, for example, horrific content. And so this is something that's different, I guess, to fast fashion. If you're going to have fast fashion, there's always going to be people who are sewing up all kinds of shitty clothes. And there's hardly any way around it, I guess. I'm not an industry expert. But in AI, it might actually be possible to use increasingly synthetic data that have been manufactured according to certain standards and to use that for training so that we need less human intervention and less humans are exploited in this sense.
So it's something that you also mentioned, that we need to have more or less practices in place. We might need to have more institutions. We might need to have people who work, sometimes even dumb jobs to track and trace and investigate these things. And while there are some aspects of that already pointed out in the AI Act of certain new government initiatives, certain new government bodies, but how do you imagine that in the future? Like just generally when it comes to actual investigative work that works with other companies, that tries to track all of these activities. This is the level of bureaucracies particularly that need to be developed to work and coincide investigate and perhaps enforce the AI Act?
That's a very good point. So, on the one hand, we now have in the AI Act all kinds of authorities that are charged with enforcing and overseeing the AI Act. And that's going to be national authorities, and they will be basically monitored by a European AI board. And also, there's going to be an AI office within the European Commission that looks at precisely foundation models. So anything that's really big and important and that's built into a lot of other systems like generative AI at the moment. So much will depend on how these new agencies are staffed, if they are going to be well-resourced and if they find the right people, not only lawyers, or political scientists, but also truly competent ML people, machine learning people. And that's very tough, of course, because industry usually pays much more. And make no mistake, of course, a country like Germany or France is in a different position than, say, Romania or Bulgaria to bring up resources for this, which doesn't mean that they will do this, but they might, and hopefully they will. There is a second perspective to this, which is interesting, and that is that the AI Act was now introduced into a register of acts that can be prosecuted, let's say, by consumer associations. And some of them are very strong in some countries. So, for example, the German one is extremely active. It's the Verbraucherzentrale Bundesverband. And so they can have a look at whether they think the AI Act is violated. And if that's so, they can bring a collective action. And that's pretty smart because, consumers might turn to them and say, hey, I was ripped off, or hey, I think something is amiss here. And if they receive enough complaints on a certain model, they might, go ahead and launch litigation, while individual consumers would rarely do this because it costs money and they have no idea about the law. But those are pros. Those are professionals. They have their lawyers. They are very litigation experienced, and they bring cases all the way up to the Supreme Court. For example, they held Meta accountable a lot of times for data protection failures and other things. So this is one interesting and positive development. A third one is missing, however, and this ties in also nicely with other research initiatives that we have at ENS. So our colleague Ulrike Klinger, she has a new project on the Digital Services Act. Now, the Digital Services Act is basically an instrument for curbing hate speech and illegal content online. It is addressed at intermediaries such as social networks, platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And they have to react if there is something amiss, if somebody, puts out hate speech or totally erroneous claims on the network. Now, how is this enforced? They have a third way of enforcing this in the DSA, and that is access for researchers. So researchers can, if the platforms are large enough, like Amazon, Facebook, they can say, hey, I want to have access to this, and I want to your systems, and I want to check if you're actually doing what it takes, if your compliance systems are working to stem the tide of hate speech and fake news. And I think that's a very clever way of doing this because the researchers, of course, they need to be registered, they need to be impartial. They cannot use this then later on for lawsuits or whatever, or at least not directly. But you have this component of civil society moving in, or academics, and basically monitoring what's going on. And I have, when I was advising various European bodies and also the federal German government for the AI Act, I have pushed quite hard to get a similar rule into the AI Act. But unfortunately, time was so short at the end that it didn't make it. So we don't have an equivalent in the AI Act. So if I'm a researcher or other researchers and you want to know about what's going on at OpenAI, you can ask them, but they might as well say no. And that's a big problem, I think. So this is where we really need a new rule to create more civil society oversight over these models. And that would be something that I'm hoping for future iterations. The AI Act needs to be reviewed every 2 years. And hopefully that's going to be on the agenda for the next iteration.
Hopefully, indeed. And since we're getting into future and speculative territories, in one recent lecture that you've had, I believe one of your own professors has told you to be bold and make claims. Well, that's going to be my final question to you today, and also to be bold and make claims. Where do you see the landscape of AI in general, and AI legislation in particular, within the next handful of, say, 5 years?
That's a tough one. That quote, by the way, comes from Ian Ayres, who was my professor at Yale. And I'm a big fan of that quote. And you need to make claims, but you also need to be able to back them up.
Absolutely.
With arguments. So let's see how that goes. So in the context of AI itself, I think there are several important avenues to watch, but I want to point out two of them. One is that you might have seen that at the end of 2023, NVIDIA unveiled a new model called Eureka that can train robots better than humans could train them. So basically writes code for machine learning systems for robots. And that's a really interesting development because it shows that now this kind of generative AI is not only impacting knowledge work, the way, journalists work, researchers, lawyers, whatever work, everybody who works with text or images, but also industry quite heavily, because it will be possible, I suppose, very shortly, to use AI to come up with training strategies for all kinds of different robots, so that you need less computer scientists to actually do that work, but you can also train robots in new ways so they can assemble new things. Maybe they can finally put together my IKEA bed or something like that. So that's one thing where I think this is going to make a major impact. And the second one is that we're seeing that AI still has extreme problems with math and logic. So if you try to ask GPT-4, for example, give me the largest number with 4 digits that contains the number 6, it will come up with all kinds of incredible stuff, but it will not hit the right one. The right answer being, of course, 9,996. And that's a pretty easy question. And, your kids could probably answer it if you have any, or like 10-year-old kids could answer it, but AI can't at the moment. And this is where we're going to see most likely, hopefully, or perhaps a breakthrough in the next few years, because many of the top research teams are actually working on this. So DeepMind in January brought forward a model called alpha geometry, and it's able to at least solve difficult geometry problems from international math Olympiads at the level of gold medalists. So those are some of the smartest mathematicians on the world at the high school level. It's not real math. It has little to do with real investigative, like academic math, but still it shows that that's a new way of reasoning. And once we get to this, where AI systems can actually process logic and math to a better extent, then we're really on track for building agents that are more sustainable, more self-sustaining, more autonomous, that can be used for better or worse again. And that's where I think, and that's my final and third point, where AI regulation needs to head to. We need to prepare for a future where increasingly AI agents will be deployed by individual actors for all kinds of things, and they will get better at this. So I could, of course, use that agent to do my scheduling, do my shopping list, whatever, or help me with my research. But also, people could use this for all kinds of sinister purposes, from fabricating fake news campaigns to actually planning terror attacks. And that's where we need to think about where we want to intervene in this field and where we have points of regulatory intervention, for example, at the level of compute. Most likely, at least at the moment, you still need a lot of compute to initially train such models. And that's where we could say, hey, I'm looking at this, or we want to look at this and make sure that those actors who actually have access to this vast compute capacities monitor what's being done with that compute to make sure that there's not agents that can do a lot of harm that are easily produced with these capabilities.
That is very informative stuff. And I would like to thank you for coming here today and taking some of your time to discuss these topics. And before we wrap up today, would you like to tell us about some of your most recent endeavors and things that you're working on?
Sure, why not? Thank you. So I've recently launched an international network that's called the International Expert Consortium for the Regulation, Economics, and Computer Science of AI, REX-AI. That's generously funded by the Dieter Schwartz Foundation. And we run all kinds of workshops and conferences. So if you're interested, check this out on the internet. And also, I'm pursuing a couple of book projects. I am involved. I'm the general editor of a large project, AI in Society, with Oxford University Press, where we're going to be publishing a lot of volumes over the next couple of years. Actually, with anything from labor to personhood to business to arts that AI impacts, and to ask, how does this affect our society? How does it affect those who might deal with it pretty well and those who might be left behind? And finally, just came out that I'm actually going to be editing a handbook on generative AI and regulation, also for Oxford University Press. So stay tuned. That should be interesting. Should come out, I hope, this summer of 2024.
Should be absolutely interesting. I highly recommend anyone out there who's interested in, well, anything AI, but specifically AI legislation, to follow Philip Hacker as well as REX-AI on LinkedIn and any other social media out there, to be just, well, in touch and be highly informed, just day in, day out. I would also like to thank the RBB here for giving us this wonderful opportunity to record at their incredible studios to basically make this happen, as well as anyone out there listening. Thank you, Philip Hacker, for joining us today. This has been very informative.
Thank you so much, Faisal. Great show. Thank you.
Welcome.